Sometimes love can break a heart so completely that even kindness feels like cruelty. Sometimes grief makes us push away the very thing that might heal us. Duncan Mackenzie walked through the snow toward home, holding a 3-month-old puppy close to his chest. He had been gone for months, trapping in the mountains. The little dog was golden and warm against his coat. When his wife Molly saw the puppy, she became angry, very angry. "Get that away from me!" she yelled. She made Duncan leave their cabin that night, sending him back into the cold with the puppy. The neighbors talked. They wondered why a wife would be so cruel, but they didn't know the real reason. They didn't know about the pain that made Molly hate that innocent little dog. What could make a woman so angry about a puppy that she would send her husband into a winter storm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains of Montana had always been Duncan Mackenzie's refuge, but they had never felt as cold as they did that December night in 1884. He pressed the golden puppy closer to his chest, feeling the small heartbeat against his ribs as he trudged through the knee-deep snow away from what had once been his home. Behind him, the warm glow of the cabin windows grew smaller, and with each step, the weight of his wife's words grew heavier. "Get that thing away from me!" Molly's voice still echoed in his ears, sharp as the winter wind that cut through his wool coat. In 15 years of marriage, he had never seen such fury in her eyes, such complete rejection. The woman who had once welcomed him home from every hunting trip with warm bread and warmer kisses had looked at him as if he were a stranger. Worse, as if he were an enemy. Duncan pulled his leather trapping journal from his coat pocket, the pages stiff with cold. For 4 months, he had filled it with careful observations about weather patterns, animal tracks, and the location of his trap lines. But between those practical entries lay the real story. His thoughts about the puppy, his plans for bringing the little creature home, his desperate hope that this small golden life might somehow bridge the chasm that had opened between him and Molly after their son died. 8 months. 8 months since the fever had taken Jamie, their only child, their bright-eyed boy, who had begged for a dog every Christmas and birthday since he could speak. 8 months since Duncan had held his son's burning body and promised him everything would be all right, knowing it was a lie. 8 months since he had watched the light leave those trusting brown eyes and felt his own world collapse. The puppy whimpered against his chest, and Duncan adjusted his hold, creating a warmer pocket of air inside his coat. "Easy there, little one," he murmured. "We'll find somewhere warm soon enough." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered if that was true. The town of Cedar Ridge lay ahead, its scattered lights barely visible through the falling snow. But where could a man go when his own wife had cast him out? Duncan remembered when Cedar Ridge had felt like home. When he and Molly had first arrived as newlyweds, the townspeople had welcomed them with genuine warmth. Dr. Rebecca Carson had delivered Jamie into the world, and Pastor Samuel Hughes had baptized the boy in the little creek that ran behind the church. Florence Whitfield had brought casseroles when Molly was too tired to cook, and the schoolteacher had marveled at Jamie's quick mind and gentle spirit. But that was before the fever, before the terrible silence that had settled over their cabin like a shroud, before Molly had removed every trace of their son from their home, his clothes, his toys, his drawings, even the little wooden animals Duncan had carved for him. She had packed it all away, as if Jamie had never existed, as if acknowledging his life would make his death more real. Duncan had tried to understand. He had tried to give Molly space to grieve in her own way, but when weeks turned to months and she still couldn't bear to speak Jamie's name, when she flinched away from Duncan's touch, as if love itself had become painful, he had done what mountain men do. He had retreated to the wilderness. The trap lines had been an excuse. He could have managed them in day trips from town, but instead he had built a rough shelter 15 miles up the mountain and stayed there for 4 months, returning to Cedar Ridge only for supplies. He told himself he was giving Molly time to heal, But the truth was simpler and more shameful. He was running from his own grief, from the sight of his wife's pain, from the terrible quiet of their home. It was in that mountain shelter that he had found the puppy, barely alive and abandoned, beside its mother's frozen body. The little golden retriever couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, its eyes barely open, its tiny body shaking with cold and hunger. Duncan had nearly walked past, thinking it already dead, but something, call it instinct, call it fate, had made him stop and look closer. The puppy had stirred at his touch, a faint whimper escaping its throat, and Duncan had felt something he hadn't experienced since Jamie died, the urgent need to protect something vulnerable. He had wrapped the creature in his spare shirt, fed it warm milk from his supplies, and nursed it back to health over the following weeks. As the puppy grew stronger, Duncan had begun to see Jamie in its bright eyes and eager spirit. This was the kind of dog his son had dreamed of, gentle, intelligent, loyal. Jamie had drawn pictures of golden dogs in the margins of his school primer, had carved their shapes in the dirt with sticks, had woven elaborate stories about the adventures he would share with his future companion. "Someday, Papa," Jamie had said just weeks before the fever took him, "someday we'll get a dog, and I'll teach him to fetch and shake hands, and maybe even how to help with the trapping." Duncan had ruffled his son's hair and promised that someday they would, never imagining how soon that someday would come, or how differently. The puppy, Duncan had taken to calling him Scout after Jamie's favorite imaginary friend, had seemed to understand the solemnity of their situation. He rarely barked, as if sensing that noise might shatter something fragile. Instead, he would sit quietly by Duncan's side as the man worked on his traps or prepared meals, occasionally placing a small paw on Duncan's leg when the grief became too heavy. It was Scout who had finally convinced Duncan to return home, not because the trapping season was ending, though it was, but because the puppy needed more care than Duncan could provide in the wilderness, and perhaps in the secret corners of his heart. Duncan had hoped that this small golden life might kindle something warm in Molly again. He had imagined her holding Scout, seeing in his innocent eyes not a replacement for Jamie, but a continuation of his spirit. How wrong he had been. Now, trudging through the snow with Scout shivering against his chest, Duncan tried to understand what had gone so terribly wrong. The fury in Molly's eyes hadn't been simple anger. It had been something deeper, more desperate. It was as if the sight of the puppy had struck her like a physical blow. The old Miller homestead came into view through the trees, its windows dark and lifeless. The family had moved east after poor harvests, leaving the small cabin empty for the past 2 years. Duncan knew the door would be unlocked. Frontier hospitality demanded that shelters remain available for travelers in need, but he had never imagined he would be one of those desperate souls seeking refuge. He pushed open the door, grateful when it swung easily on its hinges. The cabin was cold but dry, with a stone fireplace that would provide warmth once he could gather wood. Most importantly, it would give Scout shelter from the bitter wind that howled through the mountain passes. Duncan set the puppy down gently on the rough wooden floor and began the familiar ritual of making camp. He had done this countless times in the wilderness, but never with such a heavy heart. As he worked to start a fire, his mind wandered back to the cabin he and Molly had shared, to the life they had built together before tragedy tore it apart. They had met in Denver, where Molly worked as a seamstress and Duncan had come to sell furs. She had been mending a tear in his coat when he first saw her, her dark hair falling in gentle waves around her face as she worked. Her fingers moved with such grace and precision that Duncan had found himself mesmerized, inventing reasons to return to the shop just to watch her work. Their courtship had been slow and careful. Molly was city-bred, accustomed to civilization's comforts, while Duncan's life was shaped by the rhythms of wilderness and weather. But somehow they had found common ground in their shared love of simple pleasures, good conversation, honest work, the satisfaction of building something lasting. Together, When they married and moved to Cedar Ridge, Molly had adapted to frontier life with remarkable grace. She had learned to preserve meat for winter, to make soap from ash and fat, to read weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns. She had never complained about the isolation or the hardships, finding joy instead in their partnership and in the dream of the family they would build. Jamie's birth had been the culmination of their happiness. Duncan had never seen anything as beautiful as Molly holding their newborn son, singing soft lullabies while snow fell outside their window. For 7 years, they had been blessed with a contentment that seemed unshakable. The fever had changed everything in the space of 5 terrible days. One moment, Jamie was his normal, cheerful self, helping Duncan with small chores and pestering Molly for extra cookies. The next, he was burning with fever, delirious and calling for parents who could do nothing but watch helplessly as their child slipped away. Dr. Carson had done everything she could, but frontier medicine had its limits. They had applied cool cloths, administered what remedies were available, and prayed with a desperation that left them hollow. But the fever had been too strong, too sudden, and on a grey morning in April, Jamie had drawn his last breath in Molly's arms. Duncan remembered the terrible sound Molly had made when she realized their son was gone. Not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something raw and animal that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. He had held them both, his wife and his dead child, and felt something fundamental break inside himself. The weeks that followed had blurred together in a haze of arrangements and condolences. The funeral, the sympathetic visits from neighbors, the awful task of deciding what to do with Jamie's belongings. Duncan had wanted to preserve everything, to create a shrine to their son's memory, but Molly had insisted on packing it all away. "I can't," she had said, her voice flat and distant. "I can't look at his things every day and remember." Duncan had tried to argue, tried to explain that remembering Jamie should bring comfort, not pain, but Molly had been adamant. Within a week of the funeral, every trace of their son had been removed from sight. It was then that the distance had begun. Molly, who had once filled their cabin with laughter and song, became silent. She performed her daily tasks mechanically, cooking meals that grew simpler and less frequent, tending to household chores with grim efficiency but no joy. When Duncan tried to comfort her, she would stiffen in his arms. When he attempted to share memories of Jamie, she would leave the room. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Duncan had announced his intention to extend the trapping season, to spend more time in the mountains where the work demanded his full attention. Molly had nodded without looking up from her mending, and Duncan had realized with a sick certainty that his absence would bring her relief rather than sorrow. Now, 4 months later, he understood that his retreat had been a mistake. Instead of giving them both space to heal, he had abandoned his wife when she needed him most, and his return with Scout, intended as a gesture of hope and healing, had only succeeded in reopening wounds that had never properly closed. Scout padded over to where Duncan sat by the growing fire, his golden fur catching the flickering light. The puppy's eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, as if he understood the complexity of their situation. Duncan reached out to stroke the soft fur, marveling at how quickly he had grown attached to this small creature. "What are we going to do, boy?" Duncan asked softly. "Your mama made it pretty clear we're not welcome at home." Scout tilted his head, as if considering the question seriously, then settled down beside Duncan with a contented sigh. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the trees, but inside the old homestead, warmth was slowly returning. Duncan pulled a piece of dried beef from his pack and shared it with Scout, trying to plan their next move. He had some money saved from the trapping season, enough to rent space in town if necessary. But the thought of living apart from Molly indefinitely filled him with despair. 15 years of marriage couldn't end like this, could it? Surely the love that had sustained them through so many challenges was stronger than grief, stronger than Misunderstanding. But as Duncan remembered the fury in Molly's eyes, the way she had recoiled from Scout as if he carried some terrible disease, he wondered if he was being naive. Perhaps some wounds were too deep to heal. Perhaps some losses were too great to overcome. But as Scout settled more comfortably against his leg, Duncan found himself thinking of Jamie's persistent faith in happy endings, his belief that love could triumph over any obstacle. "Your son always said everything would work out," Duncan murmured to the puppy, as if Scout could somehow carry the message to Jamie. "I sure hope he was right." The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. And for the first time in months, Duncan allowed himself to hope that morning might bring better possibilities than the darkness of this night suggested. Dawn crept slowly across the Montana sky, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Duncan woke to find Scout curled against his side, the puppy's steady breathing a comfort in the cold morning air. The fire had died to embers during the night, and frost coated the inside of the windows, but they had survived their first night of exile. Duncan rebuilt the fire with practiced efficiency, his movements careful not to disturb Scout's sleep. As warmth began to fill the cabin again, his mind turned to practical matters. The puppy would need proper food soon, and they both needed a more permanent shelter than this abandoned homestead. But first, Duncan needed to understand what had happened last night, needed to make sense of Molly's explosive reaction. As he prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal and dried fruit, Duncan's thoughts drifted back 7 years to another golden morning. Jamie, barely 3 years old, had been playing in the yard when a stray dog wandered into their clearing. The animal was thin and scarred, clearly accustomed to a hard life, but Jamie had approached it with the fearless love that only children possess. "Papa, look!" Jamie had called, his small hands already buried in the dog's matted fur. "He's lonely like me." Duncan had been about to chase the animal away. Strays could carry disease or turn aggressive, but something in his son's face had stopped him. Jamie had been an only child in a sparse community, with few playmates and long stretches of solitude. The connection between boy and dog had been immediate and profound. "Can we keep him, Papa, please?" Jamie had asked, his brown eyes wide with hope. "I'll take care of him, I promise. I'll feed him and brush him and teach him tricks." Duncan had looked to Molly, expecting her to voice the practical objections he was already thinking. Instead, he had found her watching their son with tears in her eyes, moved by the pure joy on Jamie's face. "We'll see," she had said, which in the language of parents meant yes. They had named the dog Rusty for his reddish-brown coat, and he had become Jamie's constant companion. The two had been inseparable, sharing meals, afternoon naps, and elaborate games that only they understood. Rusty had been gentle and protective, seeming to understand that his job was to guard this precious child who had saved him from starvation and loneliness. When the fever took Jamie, Rusty had refused to leave the boy's bedside. The dog had lain beside the bed for 3 days, whimpering softly as Jamie grew weaker, as if trying to will life back into his young master. On the morning Jamie died, Rusty had howled, a sound so heartbroken and human that Duncan had felt it like a knife in his chest. Within a week of the funeral, Rusty had simply disappeared. Some said he had gone into the woods to die of grief, others that he had wandered off in search of his lost boy. Duncan had searched for days, calling the dog's name through the forest, but Rusty was never seen again. It was as if the dog's love for Jamie had been so complete that he couldn't survive in a world without him. Now, as Scout stirred and opened bright eyes to greet the morning, Duncan understood with terrible clarity why Molly had reacted as she did. To her, this golden puppy must have looked like a cruel parody of Rusty, a painful reminder of everything they had lost. Where Duncan saw hope and healing, Molly saw only another beloved creature that could be taken away. A soft knock at the cabin door interrupted his thoughts. Duncan opened it to find Pastor Samuel Hughes standing on the doorstep, his round face creased with concern. The minister was a small, gentle man whose faith had sustained many in the community through their darkest hours, but even he had struggled to find words of comfort after Jamie's death. "Duncan," Pastor Hughes said quietly, "I heard about last night. I came to see if you and the little one needed anything." Duncan stepped aside to let the minister in, grateful for human companionship in his confusion. Pastor Hughes bent down to pat Scout, who had approached with the friendly confidence that seemed to be his nature. "He's a beautiful animal," the pastor observed. "Looks to be healthy and well cared for." He glanced up at Duncan meaningfully. "Molly's always been a practical woman. This reaction suggests something deeper than simple opposition to having a pet." Duncan poured coffee from the pot he had prepared and handed a cup to his visitor. "I found him in the mountains, orphaned and near death. I thought—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, without revealing too much of his own pain. "You thought he might help heal the wounds Jamie's death left behind," Pastor Hughes said gently. "It wasn't foolish thinking, Duncan. I've seen animals bring comfort to grieving families before, but Molly's grief runs deep, and she may not be ready to accept anything that reminds her of what she's lost." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Scout explore his new surroundings with typical puppy curiosity. The little dog seemed remarkably well adjusted for an animal who had been through such trauma, showing none of the fearfulness or aggression that might have been expected. "There's something else," Duncan said finally, pulling a wooden toy from his pack. It was a small carved dog, roughly whittled, but unmistakably canine in shape. "I found this in Jamie's room when I was packing for the mountains, hidden under his mattress." Pastor Hughes examined the toy with reverence, understanding its significance immediately. "Jamie made this," Duncan nodded. "Must have been working on it for weeks. He was always asking to borrow my carving knife, said he wanted to make presents for Christmas." His voice caught slightly. He never got the chance to finish it. The pastor turned the wooden dog over in his hands, noting the careful attention to detail despite the child's limited skill. He was trying to carve what he hoped to have someday. "Every night he used to talk about the dog he wanted," Duncan continued. "Golden hair like summer wheat," he used to say. "Smart enough to help with chores, but gentle enough to sleep on his bed." He had it all planned out, what he would name it, what tricks he would teach it, how they would explore the woods together. Pastor Hughes set down the wooden toy and looked directly at Duncan. "And now you've found exactly that dog." "I know how it sounds," Duncan said quickly. "I know it seems like wishful thinking or worse, but when I saw Scout in the wilderness, so close to death, I couldn't help but think of Jamie. It was as if your son had sent him to you." The pastor finished gently. "Faith takes many forms, Duncan. Sometimes it comes through prayer and scripture, sometimes through the kindness of neighbors, and sometimes through the love of an innocent animal who needs us as much as we need it." Scout had wandered over to where the wooden dog lay and was sniffing it with interest. Suddenly, he picked up the toy in his mouth and brought it to Duncan, tail wagging as if presenting a gift. The gesture was so perfectly timed, so eerily appropriate, that both men fell silent. "I need to talk to Molly," Duncan said finally. "Need to help her understand that I'm not trying to replace Jamie or forget him. I'm trying to honor his memory." Pastor Hughes nodded slowly. "But first, she needs to be ready to listen. Grief has its own timeline, and it can't be hurried. Perhaps it would be best to give her a few days to process what happened last night." As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Rebecca Carson appeared at the door. The town's physician was a practical woman in her 50s who had delivered half the children in Cedar Ridge and tended to most of their ailments. Her presence usually meant someone needed medical attention. "I heard you were staying out here," she said without preamble, stepping into the cabin and examining Scout with professional interest. "Brought some supplies for the puppy, milk, some medicine in case he's picked up parasites in the wild." Scout approached the doctor without fear, allowing her to examine his ears, teeth, and coat. "He's in remarkable condition for an animal who was living rough," she observed. Someone cared for him well during his first weeks of life. His mother, Duncan explained. She died, but she must have been a good mother while she lived. Dr. Carson completed her examination and pronounced Scout healthy. He'll need regular feeding for the next few months, and he should be socialized with people other than yourself. Dogs that bond too closely to one person can become problematic. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Molly came to see me this morning. She's not well, Duncan. The shock of seeing you with this puppy, it's brought up all the grief she's been trying to suppress. She hasn't been eating properly, hasn't been sleeping. I'm concerned about her physical and mental health. Duncan felt guilt settle over him like a heavy blanket. I never meant to hurt her. I know what you thought, Dr. Carson interrupted kindly, and it wasn't wrong thinking. This puppy could indeed bring healing in time. But healing can't be forced, and Molly isn't ready for what you're offering. Pastor Hughes stood to leave, placing a gentle hand on Duncan's shoulder. Stay here for now. Let me talk to some of the church ladies about helping Molly through this difficult time. And keep that puppy close. He's going to be important to this story, I believe. After both visitors had gone, Duncan sat by the fire, with Scout curled in his lap. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny spirits. In this light, Scout's golden fur seemed to glow with inner warmth, and Duncan could almost hear Jamie's voice, describing the perfect dog he had dreamed of having. I don't know what to do, boy, Duncan murmured, stroking the puppy's soft ears. I thought love would be enough, but maybe some hurts go too deep for love to reach. Scout looked up at him with those remarkably intelligent eyes, then settled back into sleep with the perfect trust that only the very young possess. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of more snow and the uncertainty of winter. But inside the abandoned cabin, a man and a puppy waited for morning to bring answers they couldn't yet imagine. 3 days passed before Duncan ventured into Cedar Ridge proper, and when he did, it was with Scout tucked securely inside his coat and a growing list of necessities that the old homestead couldn't provide. The puppy needed proper food, and Duncan needed work if they were going to survive the winter apart from Molly. The town seemed smaller than he remembered, its main street lined with modest wooden buildings that housed the essentials of frontier life: the general store, the doctor's office, the church, and McCready's saloon, where local men gathered to discuss weather, politics, and the private affairs of their neighbors. Duncan had little doubt that his situation had become a prime topic of conversation. He stopped first at Henderson's general store, where Martha Henderson greeted him with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had heard gossip but was too polite to ask direct questions. Scout peeked out from Duncan's coat, drawing a gentle smile from the storekeeper's wife. "He's a beautiful little thing," Martha observed, reaching out to stroke Scout's head. "Looks to be a golden retriever, or mostly so. They're good dogs, loyal and smart." Duncan purchased supplies with the money from his trapping season. Proper puppy food, a collar and lead, a few basic tools for repairs to the homestead. As Martha tallied his purchases, she mentioned casually that the Whitmore family was looking for someone to help with their winter wood cutting. "Thomas hurt his back last month," she explained. "They've got the timber marked and ready, just need someone with a strong back and sharp axe to do the cutting. Pays fair wages, and Catherine's a fine cook. She'd likely send meals along with the pay." Duncan accepted the information gratefully. Work would give him purpose and income, both of which he desperately needed. But more importantly, it would keep him in town, where he might occasionally catch sight of Molly, might find opportunities to bridge the terrible distance between them. The Whitmore place sat on the edge of town, a modest farm with a small herd of cattle and extensive vegetable gardens that helped feed several neighboring families. Thomas Whitmore was a man Duncan's age, who walked with a careful stiffness that spoke of genuine injury rather than laziness. "Heard you might need help with wood cutting," Duncan said without preamble. Frontier life had no patience for elaborate social courtesies. Thomas nodded, studying Duncan with the shrewd eye of a man who knew the value of good work. 20 cords need splitting before the heavy snows come. Can you handle an axe 8 hours a day? I can, Duncan replied simply. He had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than promises in communities like this one. What about the puppy? Thomas asked, noticing Scout's head emerging from Duncan's coat. Can't have animals disrupting the work. As if understanding the question, Scout hopped down from Duncan's arms and sat quietly at his feet, looking up at Thomas with bright, attentive eyes. The display of discipline in such a young animal was impressive enough that Thomas nodded approvingly. Well trained. That's good. Catherine's got a soft spot for dogs, and the children will likely want to play with him during breaks. Just keep him clear of the axe work. Duncan started immediately, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. The axe felt good. In his hands, the satisfying crack of splitting wood, providing an outlet for emotions he couldn't otherwise express. Scout settled nearby, watching the work with intelligent curiosity while staying safely out of range of flying wood chips. True to Martha's word, Catherine Whitmore sent lunch along with her husband, thick sandwiches, hot coffee, and generous portions of apple cake that reminded Duncan painfully of Molly's baking. The Whitmore children, ranging in age from 6 to 12, were initially shy around Scout, but gradually warmed to his friendly nature. He's just like the dog in my reader, announced Lucy, the youngest Whitmore child, the one who saves the lost children in the forest. Duncan paused in his work, remembering how Jamie had loved that same story. What's the dog's name in your book? Faithful, Lucy replied promptly, because he's faithful to the children even when everyone else gives up looking for them. The name struck Duncan with unexpected force. Faithful. It seemed appropriate for this puppy who had already shown such loyalty, who had somehow found his way into Duncan's life at exactly the moment when faithfulness to memory, to hope, to the possibility of healing was most needed. That evening, Duncan returned to the homestead with Scout trotting beside him on his new lead. The puppy had grown visibly in just the few days since their exile, his legs longer, his coat fuller, his confidence expanding with each new experience, but it was his behavior around people that impressed Duncan most. Scout seemed to understand human emotions with unusual sensitivity, offering quiet comfort when someone was sad, playful energy when joy was needed. As they approached the cabin, Duncan noticed fresh footprints in the snow around the building. Someone had been here while he was working, and from the size and pattern of the prints, he was fairly certain it had been Molly. His heart raced with hope and fear in equal measure. Inside, he found evidence of his wife's visit, a basket of her homemade bread on the table, still warm enough to suggest recent delivery. Beside it lay a small bowl filled with scraps of meat and vegetables, clearly intended for Scout. The gesture was small, but it represented the first crack in the wall Molly had built around her heart. Scout approached the bowl with tail wagging, but instead of eating immediately, he looked up at Duncan, as if asking permission. The polite behavior brought tears to Duncan's eyes. This was exactly the kind of mannerly dog Jamie had dreamed of, the companion who would be both friend and helper. Go ahead, boy, Duncan said softly. Eat up. As Scout enjoyed Molly's offering, Duncan examined the bread more closely. It was Jamie's favorite recipe, the sweet wheat loaf that Molly had baked for their son's birthday each year. The fact that she had chosen this particular bread, had taken the time to prepare food with such care, suggested that her anger might be softening into something more complex. Hope flickered in Duncan's chest like a candle flame in wind, fragile, precious, easily extinguished, but undeniably real. Perhaps Molly's heart wasn't as closed as it had seemed 3 nights ago. Perhaps the sight of Scout hadn't destroyed all possibility of reconciliation, but had instead planted seeds that might eventually grow into acceptance. That night, as Scout, Curled up beside the fire, with his belly full of Molly's cooking, Duncan allowed himself to imagine a future where the three of them might share the same roof again. It was a dangerous dream, one that could lead to devastating disappointment, but it was also the only dream worth pursuing. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks that marked Molly's secret visit. But inside the cabin, the warmth of her bread and the contented sighs of a well-fed puppy suggested that some gifts transcend the barriers that grief and misunderstanding create. Sometimes love finds ways to express itself, even when words fail, even when hearts are too broken to admit their own capacity for healing. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Duncan would work during the day, splitting wood for the Whitmores and taking on other odd jobs around town, while Scout charmed everyone he met with his intelligence and gentle nature. In the evenings, they would return to the old homestead to find small tokens of Molly's presence. Sometimes food, sometimes freshly laundered clothing, once a new blanket that smelled of the lavender soap she made each spring. These silent offerings gave Duncan hope, but they also highlighted the cruel distance between them. They were married people living like strangers, communicating through gestures, while the most important conversation of their lives remained unspoken. Duncan respected Molly's need for space, but with each passing day, his worry for her welfare grew stronger. It was Florence Whitfield who finally gave voice to Duncan's concerns. The widow appeared at the homestead one evening carrying a covered dish and wearing the determined expression of a woman who had decided to intervene in matters others preferred to ignore. Florence had lost her own child 3 years earlier, a daughter who had died in a riding accident, and her journey through grief had taught her hard lessons about survival and recovery. She was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who truly understood what Molly was experiencing, and her presence carried an authority that even the most stubborn hearts couldn't easily dismiss. "Duncan Mackenzie," she said without preamble, setting down her dish and fixing him with a steady gaze. "We need to talk about your wife." Scout approached Florence with his usual friendly interest, and she bent to scratch his ears while continuing to speak. "I've been trying to visit Molly for weeks now, and she won't let me pass the door. Won't speak to Dr. Carson either, except to say she's fine when she clearly isn't. The woman's wasting away from grief and stubbornness, and someone needs to do something about it." Duncan felt his chest tighten with familiar guilt and worry. "I've tried to respect her wishes, to give her space to heal in her own way." "Space is one thing," Florence replied sharply. "Isolation is another entirely. I watched my neighbors give me space after my Caroline died, and I nearly died myself from loneliness and despair. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a grieving person is refuse to let them disappear." She straightened up, her expression softening slightly. "I'm not saying you should force your way back into that cabin, Duncan, but this silent dance you're doing, leaving gifts and hoping she'll come around on her own, it's not working. Molly needs to know that someone still sees her as more than just a woman destroyed by loss." Duncan felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. In his effort to avoid causing Molly more pain, he had essentially abandoned her to face her darkest moments alone. The small gifts they exchanged were gestures of love, but they were also barriers that prevented real communication. "What would you suggest?" he asked quietly. Florence was quiet for a moment, watching Scout chase a leaf that had blown into the cabin through the open door. "That puppy of yours," she said finally. "He has something special about him. I've seen how he is with people. Gentle, understanding, like he knows exactly what they need. The Whitmore children talk about him constantly, and old Mrs. Peterson smiled for the first time since her husband died when Scout visited her last week." Duncan nodded. He had noticed the same thing. Scout seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense human emotion and respond appropriately. With children he was playful but never rough. With adults who were sad or worried, he would simply sit nearby, offering his quiet presence as comfort. I think Molly needs to see that this dog isn't a replacement for what she lost, Florence continued. He's something new, something that could help her remember joy without betraying grief. But she can't learn that if she never spends time with him, she won't see me, Duncan said simply. Every time I've tried to approach the cabin, she disappears inside before I can get close enough to speak. Florence smiled with the satisfaction of a woman who had anticipated this obstacle. Then, don't go to her. Let her come to you, or more precisely, let her come to Scout. Winter's settling in hard now, and people will need help. Make yourself useful in ways that put you and that puppy where Molly can see you without feeling cornered. Over the following days, Duncan took Florence's advice to heart. He began taking Scout with him when he delivered split wood to elderly residents, when he helped repair wind damage to the church roof, when he assisted Dr. Carson in moving medical supplies. The puppy's presence transformed these routine tasks into small social events, as people stopped to admire Scout's intelligence and gentle nature. It was during one of these visits that Duncan learned something that changed his understanding of their situation completely. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman Florence had mentioned, was sitting on her porch, wrapped in blankets, while Duncan repaired her loose shutters. Scout lay at her feet, content to serve as a furry foot-warmer. "He reminds me of the dogs I had as a girl back in Ohio," Mrs. Peterson said, her weathered hands gently stroking Scout's coat. "Golden retrievers they were, smartest dogs you ever saw, and gentle as lambs with children." Duncan paused in his work. "You had retrievers?" "Oh yes, bred them for years before I married and came west. Beautiful animals, bred for hunting but gentle enough to trust with infants." She smiled down at Scout. "This one has the look of good breeding about him. His mother must have been something special." The conversation continued as Duncan worked, Mrs. Peterson sharing stories of the dogs she had known and loved. But it was her casual mention of a particular trait that made Duncan's hand still on his tools. "The best ones always seemed to know when someone was grieving," she said. "They'd seek out the saddest person in a room and just sit with them, quiet-like, as if they understood that sometimes the best comfort is just knowing you're not alone." That evening, Duncan sat by his fire with Scout curled in his lap, thinking about Mrs. Peterson's words. A memory surfaced from the depths of his mind. Jamie, perhaps 5 years old, coming home from the schoolhouse in tears because another child had teased him about being small. Rusty had appeared from nowhere, pressing close to Jamie's side and licking the tears from his cheeks. The dog had then performed every trick he knew, rolling over, playing dead, standing on his hind legs, until Jamie was laughing instead of crying. It was as if Rusty had understood exactly what his boy needed, and had set out to provide it. Now Scout displayed the same intuitive understanding, the same gentle wisdom that seemed beyond his months. Could it be that some dogs were simply born with hearts that recognized human pain and instinctively sought to heal it? Duncan was still pondering this question when he heard footsteps approaching the cabin. Through the window, he glimpsed a familiar figure moving carefully through the snow, Molly, carrying what looked like a bundle of clothing. His heart raced as he watched her approach the door, then hesitate. She stood there for several minutes, clearly struggling with some internal debate. Scout had heard her too, and was watching the door with alert attention, his tail wagging hopefully. Finally, Molly knocked. A soft, tentative sound that seemed to echo through the cabin like thunder. Duncan rose slowly, hardly daring to believe. This moment had arrived. When he opened the door, he found his wife standing in the moonlight, her face pale but determined. "Duncan," she said quietly, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "We need to talk." Behind her, hidden in the sewing basket she had thought was safely concealed in her dresser drawer, lay the half-finished baby blanket she had been working on when Jamie died. She had started it in hope, continued it in joy as her pregnancy progressed, and abandoned it in despair when fever took her child. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, She had felt compelled to bring it along, as if some part of her understood that healing sometimes required facing the dreams that death had interrupted. Scout approached the doorway slowly, his tail wagging gently, his eyes fixed on Molly's face with patient, hopeful attention. For a moment, woman and puppy regarded each other in silence, while Duncan held his breath and waited to see if love could indeed find a way to bridge the chasm that grief had created. Molly stepped across the threshold of the old homestead with the careful movements of someone entering sacred ground. Her eyes took in the simple domestic scene. Duncan by the fire, Scout alert and waiting, the evidence of a life being rebuilt, from fragments. And Duncan saw her face soften with something that might have been recognition. "He's grown," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on Scout. The puppy had indeed changed in the weeks since their confrontation. His legs longer, his coat fuller, his bearing more confident but somehow still gentle. "He has," Duncan agreed, unsure. Whether to remain seated or stand, whether to speak more or wait for Molly to lead this long-overdue conversation. "He's learned his name, Scout, after Jamie's imaginary friend." Molly's face flickered with pain at their son's name, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she moved closer to the fire, setting down her basket with hands that trembled slightly from cold or emotion. "I remember, Jamie used to tell stories about Scout, how he was brave and loyal and always knew the right thing to do." Scout approached Molly slowly, his tail wagging in careful, measured beats that suggested he understood the delicacy of this moment. When he reached her feet, he sat down and looked up at her with patient, hopeful eyes. Molly stared down at him for a long moment before reaching out tentatively to touch his head. "His fur is so soft," she murmured, her fingers moving gently through Scout's golden coat. "Softer than I expected." Duncan watched his wife's face transform as she petted Scout, seeing glimpses of the woman he had married, tender, nurturing, capable of finding joy in simple pleasures. It had been so long since he had seen that expression on her face that he had almost forgotten how beautiful she was when happiness touched her features. "Molly," he said carefully, "I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you by bringing him home. I thought—" "I know what you thought," Molly interrupted, but her voice was gentle rather than sharp. "You thought he might help us heal, help us remember Jamie, without the pain being so overwhelming." She continued petting Scout, who had leaned into her touch with the perfect trust of a creature who knew he was safe. "I wasn't ready to see that. When you walked through our door carrying him, all I could think about was Rusty, how he died of a grief after Jamie." Her voice caught, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. "I couldn't bear the thought of loving something else that might leave me," she admitted. "It felt like betrayal, of Jamie's memory, of my promise to never forget him, of the pain that was all I had left of our son." Duncan rose slowly and moved to kneel beside Molly's chair, careful not to crowd her, but close enough to offer comfort if she wanted it. "You haven't betrayed anything, Molly. Jamie wouldn't want you to stop loving things because you loved him." Molly's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in months, they didn't seem like tears of pure anguish. "I've been so angry, Duncan. Angry at God for taking him. Angry at you for leaving me alone. Angry at myself for not being able to save him." The anger was easier than the sadness because anger feels like strength. "And what does this feel like?" Duncan asked gently, nodding toward where her hand rested on Scout's head. Molly considered the question seriously, her fingers continuing their gentle motion through Scout's fur. "Frightening," she said finally, "but also warm, like remembering. Something beautiful instead of something terrible." As if sensing the importance of this moment, Scout shifted slightly and rested his head on Molly's lap, his eyes closing in contentment. The simple gesture of trust and affection broke through the last of Molly's defenses, and she began to cry, not the bitter tears of rage and despair that had characterized her grief, but the cleansing tears of release. Duncan reached out carefully and took her free hand in his, half expecting her to pull away. Instead, she squeezed his fingers tightly, as if anchoring herself to something solid, while the storm of long-suppressed emotion moved through her. "I missed you," she whispered through her tears. "I missed you so much, but I didn't know how to reach across all that pain and anger to tell you." "I'm here now," Duncan said simply. "We're both here, and we don't have to carry this alone anymore." They sat together in the firelight, hands joined, Scout sleeping peacefully in Molly's lap, and slowly began to talk about things they hadn't been able to discuss since Jamie's death. They spoke of their son's last days, of the guilt they both carried, of the different ways grief had affected them. They talked about Rusty and how his loss had compounded their sorrow, making the house feel even emptier than Jamie's absence alone could account for. "I packed away his school primer last month," Molly admitted during a lull in their conversation. "I couldn't stand seeing it on the shelf, but when I opened it to put it in the trunk, I found something I'd never noticed before." She reached into her basket and withdrew Jamie's school primer, its pages worn from countless readings. Opening it carefully, she showed Duncan the margins where their son had drawn small figures throughout the book. Dogs of every size and description, some realistic, others fantastical, all rendered with the hopeful inexperience of childhood. "He drew them everywhere," Molly said softly, "even in his arithmetic lessons. Dogs helping children, dogs protecting families, dogs being loyal and brave and faithful." Duncan studied the drawings with wonder and growing understanding. Here was proof of Jamie's persistent dream, evidence that his desire for a canine companion had permeated every aspect of his young life. He really did want a dog more than anything else in the world, and he never got one while he was alive to enjoy it, Molly said, her voice heavy with regret. "We kept saying someday and maybe next year, always finding reasons to postpone. What would have made him so happy?" Duncan lifted Scout gently from Molly's lap and held him up so they could both see his face clearly. The puppy regarded them with alert, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding unusual in so young an animal. "Maybe this is someday," Duncan said quietly. "Maybe Scout is Jamie's way of telling us that love doesn't end with death, that the things we hope for can still come true even when we're not there to see them ourselves." Molly reached out to stroke Scout's face, her touch gentle and wondering. "He does have Jamie's eyes," she said with the faintest smile. "That same trusting look, that same certainty that everything will work out if you just love hard enough." As if responding to his name being spoken, Scout licked Molly's hand with gentle affection, then settled back into Duncan's arms with a contented sigh. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the old homestead, 3 hearts that had been broken. By loss began the slow, careful process of healing together. The conversation that began that snowy evening continued over the following days as Molly made the journey to the homestead each morning, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes leaving quickly when the emotions became too intense. Scout served as a bridge between them, his presence making difficult topics more bearable, his intuitive responses to their moods creating moments of lightness in otherwise heavy discussions. It was during one of these visits that Molly revealed the depth of her fear about loving again. She had brought her sewing with her, a simple mending task that gave her hands something to do while her heart struggled with complicated feelings. Scout lay beside her chair, occasionally lifting his head when her voice grew emotional, as if monitoring her well-being. "After Rusty disappeared, I told myself it was better," Molly said, her needle moving in steady, practiced strokes. "One less creature to worry about, one less heart that could be broken. But the truth was, I felt like I'd failed him too. Failed Jamie by not getting him the dog he wanted while he was alive. Failed Rusty by not being able to comfort him after Jamie died." Duncan looked up from the harness he was repairing. Since Molly had begun visiting, he had found reasons to do his craft work at the homestead rather than in town, treasuring these domestic moments that reminded him of their life before. Tragedy changed everything. "You didn't fail anyone, Molly. We both did the best we could with an impossible situation." "Did we?" Molly's hands stilled on her sewing. Sometimes I think about what Jamie's last weeks would have been like if he'd had a dog. Maybe he wouldn't have been so lonely lying sick in bed. Maybe Rusty would have sensed the illness earlier, alerted us somehow. Scout rose from his position by the fire and padded over to Molly, resting his chin on her knee with the gentle pressure that had become his signature gesture of comfort. Without conscious thought, Molly began stroking his head, finding solace in the soft texture of his coat. "I've been reading about dogs," she said suddenly, as if the admission surprised her. "Borrowed books from the pastor about different breeds, their temperaments, their capabilities. Golden retrievers were bred to be gentle with their mouths, to retrieve waterfowl without damaging them, but they're also known for their ability to sense human emotions, to provide comfort to the sick and grieving." Duncan felt his heart lift with cautious hope. "What does that tell you?" Molly was quiet for a long moment, her fingers moving through Scout's fur while she considered her words. "It tells me that maybe finding Scout wasn't an accident. Maybe dogs like him are meant to help people like us, people who have forgotten how to hope, how to love without fear." She looked directly at Duncan for the first time in their conversation. "I want to try, Duncan. I want to try to trust that loving Scout won't dishonor Jamie's memory, that opening my heart to this puppy doesn't mean I've forgotten our son." Duncan set aside his work and moved to kneel beside Molly's chair, taking her free hand in both of his. "Jamie would want us to love Scout," he said with quiet conviction. "He would want us to give this puppy all the love we never got to give to the dog he dreamed of having." Tears slipped down Molly's cheeks, but they were gentler tears than the bitter ones she had shed for so many months. "I found something else," she whispered, reaching into her sewing basket, "hidden in the family Bible." She withdrew a pressed wildflower, a simple mountain daisy that had been carefully preserved between the pages of Scripture. Duncan recognized it immediately as one of the flowers from Jamie's funeral, the small white blooms that had covered his grave like fallen stars. "I pressed it the day we buried him," Molly explained. "I wanted to keep something beautiful from that terrible day, something that would remind me that life continues even in the presence of death." She held the flower up to the firelight, its delicate petals translucent with age, but still recognizably beautiful. Scout watched her with alert attention, as if understanding the significance of this fragile treasure. "Jamie always loved wildflowers," Molly continued. "He used to pick bouquets for me every spring, dandelions and daisies and whatever else caught his fancy. He'd present them so proudly, as if they were the finest roses money could buy." Duncan remembered those impromptu bouquets, how Molly would display them in her best vase and treat them with the reverence usually reserved for precious things. Jamie had glowed with pride each time, understanding that his mother valued his gifts not for their monetary worth, but for the love they represented. "What if we planted wildflowers around Jamie's grave this spring?" Duncan suggested gently. "The kinds he used to pick for you. We could make it a place of beauty instead of just sorrow." Molly nodded slowly, the idea taking root in her imagination. "He would like that, and maybe—" She looked down at Scout, who was still resting his head on her knee. "Maybe Scout could help us tend them. Jamie always said he wanted a dog who could help with important jobs." The suggestion hung in the air between them, representing a future they could build together, not the future they had planned before. Grief changed everything, but a different future that honored their loss while still allowing for hope and healing. Duncan rose and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that would soon give way to spring. "I've been thinking about the cabin," he said carefully. "About whether you'd be willing to, whether we might—" "I don't know if I'm ready to have you come home yet," Molly said quickly, but her voice was gentle rather than rejecting. "There are still so many feelings I need to sort through, so many fears I need to face. But maybe Scout could visit sometimes, help me get used to the idea of sharing my space again." It wasn't the reunion Duncan had hoped for, but it was progress, real, meaningful progress toward healing their marriage and their broken hearts. Scout seemed to understand the significance of the moment, because he moved to sit precisely between Duncan and Molly, as if positioning himself to bridge any remaining distance between them. "I'd like that," Duncan said simply. "Scout would like that too." As if responding to his name, Scout's tail began to wag, a gentle metronome of contentment that filled the cabin with the sound of simple happiness. Outside, the wind continued to whisper through the pine trees. But inside, three souls who had been separated by grief began to discover that love could indeed survive the darkest winters of the heart. It was while Duncan was helping Molly carry her sewing supplies back to the cabin one evening that she noticed the letter protruding from his coat pocket. The envelope was worn and stained from months of handling, its edges soft with repeated folding and unfolding. Something about the careful way Duncan adjusted his coat to conceal it caught her attention. "What's that letter you keep carrying?" she asked as they paused at her doorstep, Scout sitting patiently between them in the gathering dusk. Duncan's face went pale in the lamplight, and his hand moved instinctively to cover the pocket. "It's nothing important, just old correspondence." But Molly had been married to this man for 15 years, and she recognized the expression he wore when he was keeping something significant from her, not from malice, but from a desire to protect her from difficult truths. It was the same expression he had worn when he tried to shield her from the worst details of Jamie's illness. The same careful guardedness that appeared whenever he thought knowledge might cause her pain. "Duncan," she said quietly but firmly, "we've just spent weeks learning to be honest with each other again. Don't start keeping secrets now." Scout looked between them with the alertness of an animal who sensed emotional tension. His tail still, but his ears pricked forward attentively. Duncan stared down at the puppy for a long moment, as if seeking guidance, then slowly withdrew the letter from his pocket. "It's from Dr. Carson," he said reluctantly. "From the day Jamie died. She gave it to me right after the funeral, but I couldn't bear to share it with you then. You were already carrying so much pain, and I thought this would only make things worse." Molly felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What does it say?" Duncan's hands shook slightly as he unfolded the well-worn pages. "Maybe we should go inside. This isn't something to discuss standing in the cold." They entered Molly's cabin together, the first time Duncan had crossed this threshold since the night he had been cast out with Scout. The familiar surroundings felt strange to him now, like visiting a place from a half-remembered dream. Molly noticed his discomfort and gestured toward the chairs by the fire, creating a neutral space where they could talk without the weight of too much shared history. Scout settled himself equidistant from both chairs, as if understanding that his role was to provide comfort to whichever human needed it most. Duncan took a deep breath and began to read. "Duncan and Molly," he began, his voice careful and measured. "I wanted you to know about my final conversation with Jamie, but I wasn't sure when or how to share this with you. In his last lucid moments, your son asked me to make sure you understood something important." Molly leaned forward in her chair, her hands gripped tightly together. "What did he want us to understand?" Duncan's voice grew softer as he continued. Reading. "Jamie knew he was dying. Children often understand these things before adults are ready to accept them. He asked me to tell you that he wasn't afraid because he knew how much you both loved him, but he was worried about what would happen to you after he was gone." Tears began to slip down Molly's cheeks, but she gestured for Duncan to continue. Scout rose from his position and moved to sit beside her chair, pressing his warm body against her leg in silent support. "He specifically asked me to make sure you got a dog," Duncan read, his own voice breaking slightly. "He said golden retrievers were especially good for sad people because they were patient and loving and never gave up on anyone. He had been planning to ask you for one for Christmas, but he wanted you to know that even if he couldn't be there to help take care of it, he still wanted you to have the happiness a good dog could bring." The letter fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and Molly's quiet weeping. Duncan looked up to find his wife staring at Scout with an expression of wonder and recognition, as if seeing the puppy clearly for the first time. Jamie asked. For this, she whispered. He specifically wanted us to have a dog after he died. Duncan nodded, pulling another sheet from the envelope. There's more. Dr. Carson wrote down his exact words because she thought they were important. He cleared his throat and continued reading in Jamie's own voice, as recorded by the doctor. Tell Mama and Papa that I want them to get a golden dog, like the one in my reader. One that's smart and gentle and knows how to make people feel better. When they're crying, tell them it's not to replace me, but to help them remember that love doesn't stop just because someone goes to heaven. And tell them that when they see the dog being happy and good, they can think about me being happy too. Molly's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob that was part grief and part amazement. Scout moved closer, resting his head in her lap, with the intuitive timing that had characterized his behavior since Duncan had first found him. He knew, she said through her tears. Our little boy knew exactly what we would need, and he tried to give it to us, even though he couldn't stay to see it happen himself. Duncan set the letter aside and moved to kneel beside Molly's chair. That's not all, though. Dr. Carson admits in the letter that she should have given us this message right away, but she was so overwhelmed by her own grief over losing Jamie that she forgot. She only remembered when she heard I had come back with a puppy, and she realized that somehow Jamie's wish had come true anyway, Molly finished, her voice filled with awe. Even though we never got his message, somehow you found exactly the dog he asked for. Duncan nodded, reaching out to stroke Scout's golden fur. When I found him in the mountains, half dead and abandoned, something told me I had to save him. I told myself it was just instinct, but maybe it was something more. Molly lifted Scout into her arms, holding him close and studying his intelligent eyes with new understanding. Jamie always believed in magic, she said softly. Not the kind in fairy tales, but the kind that happens when people love each other. Enough. He used to say that love was the strongest force in the world, strong enough to work miracles, if you believed hard enough. Scout settled contentedly in Molly's embrace, his tail wagging gently, as if he understood that he had finally found his true home. The three of them sat together in the firelight, husband, wife, and the puppy who had been sent by love itself to heal hearts that seemed too broken to mend. I was so angry at you for bringing him, Molly admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I thought you were trying to replace Jamie, or trying to force me to move on before I was ready. But all along, you were just fulfilling our son's last wish without even knowing it. Duncan took her free hand in his, marveling at the mysterious ways that love could work across the boundaries of life and death. Jamie was always smarter than both of us, he said with a mixture of sadness and pride. Even at the end, he was thinking about how to take care of us. Outside, snow continued to fall on Cedar Ridge, covering the landscape in pristine white that made everything look new and full of possibility. But inside the cabin, three hearts that had been wounded by loss began to understand that healing was not just possible, but inevitable, when guided by the enduring wisdom of a child who had understood that love transcends even death itself. Scout dozed peacefully in Molly's arms, his breathing steady and content, unaware that he was not just a rescued puppy, but a living prayer answered, a gift of grace that had traveled across mountains and through months of separation to bring hope to those who had forgotten how to find it for themselves. The revelation of Jamie's letter transformed everything between Duncan and Molly, but it also created new challenges neither of them had anticipated. Understanding that Scout was not just a random puppy, but the fulfillment of their son's dying wish brought comfort, but it also brought overwhelming responsibility. How do you care for a gift from heaven? How do you prove worthy of such profound grace? In the days following the letter's revelation, Molly threw herself into learning everything she could about golden retrievers, their care, training, and temperament. She borrowed books from anyone who had them, questioned Mrs. Peterson extensively about her experience with the breed, and even wrote letters to breeders in Denver seeking advice about proper nutrition and exercise for a growing puppy. Duncan watched this transformation with amazement and growing concern. The woman who had barely been able to care for herself was now channeling her grief into an almost frantic dedication to Scout's well-being. She visited the homestead daily, bringing elaborate meals for both Duncan and the puppy, carefully prepared, according to the dietary recommendations she had researched. She had even begun sewing a proper bed for Scout, complete with her finest embroidery work. "Molly," Duncan said gently one afternoon as he watched her fuss over Scout's feeding schedule, "he's just a puppy. He's not just a..." "Puppy?" Molly interrupted, her voice sharp with something that might have been desperation. "He's Jamie's gift to us, the last thing our son will ever be able to give us. We have to do right by him, Duncan. We have to prove that Jamie's trust in us wasn't misplaced." Scout looked between them with the expression of a creature who sensed tension but didn't understand its source. He had grown considerably in the weeks since his arrival, his legs longer and stronger, his coat thicker and more lustrous. But despite his physical development, he remained gentle and intuitive, still possessing that uncanny ability to sense human emotions and respond appropriately. It was Pastor Hughes who finally helped Duncan understand what was happening. The minister had taken to visiting the homestead regularly, ostensibly to check on their spiritual welfare, but actually because he found Scout's presence remarkably soothing after long days of counseling troubled parishioners. "She's trying to earn forgiveness," Pastor Hughes observed one evening, as they watched Molly carefully brush Scout's coat for the third time that day. "She believes that if she can be the perfect caretaker for this dog, somehow she'll prove herself worthy of Jamie's love, worthy of the gift he tried to give her." Duncan felt understanding dawn like sunrise over mountain peaks. "She thinks she failed Jamie by not getting him a dog while he was alive. And she's terrified of failing him again," the pastor confirmed. "But perfection born from fear isn't what Jamie wanted for his parents. He wanted them to find joy again, to experience the simple pleasure of loving a good dog." That evening, Duncan found the courage to address Molly's mounting anxiety directly. She was sitting by the fire, carefully examining Scout's paws for any sign of irritation or injury, her movements precise but tense with worry. "Molly," he said carefully, settling into the chair beside her, "do you remember what Jamie used to say about Rusty's imperfections?" Molly paused in her examination, her hands stilling on Scout's fur. "What do you mean?" "Remember how Rusty used to steal food from the table, how he'd track mud through the house, how he'd howl at thunderstorms and wake the whole family?" Duncan smiled at the memories. "Jamie never cared about any of that. He loved Rusty, not because the dog was perfect, but because he was real, because he was theirs." Molly's eyes filled with tears as the memories surfaced. "Jamie used to say that Rusty's mistakes made him more lovable, not less. He said perfect dogs would be boring because you could never surprise them or teach them anything new." "And what do you think Jamie would say about the way you're treating Scout now?" Duncan asked gently. Molly looked down at the puppy, who was regarding her with patient, trusting eyes. "He'd probably tell me to stop fussing and just play with him," she admitted with a shaky laugh. "He'd say I was missing the whole point of having a dog." As if responding to his cue, Scout nudged Molly's hand with his nose, then bounded over to a corner where Duncan had carved him a simple wooden toy. The puppy grabbed the toy in his mouth and brought it back to Molly, dropping it at her feet, with a playful bow that was unmistakably an invitation to play. For the first time since Scout's arrival, Molly laughed, a real laugh, spontaneous and joyful. She picked up the toy and tossed it gently across the cabin. Scout retrieved it eagerly, his tail wagging with pure delight, and brought it back for another throw. They played together for nearly an hour, the tension gradually leaving Molly's shoulders as she rediscovered the simple pleasure of interacting with a happy, healthy puppy. Duncan watched from his chair, marveling at the transformation in his wife's face as worry gave way to genuine enjoyment. But it was as Christmas approached that their fragile healing faced its greatest test. The holiday had been Jamie's favorite time of year, and the thought of celebrating without him felt like betrayal. Molly had been dreading the season for months, and now that it was upon them, she found herself paralyzed by conflicting emotions. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed to Duncan one snowy evening. "I don't know how to celebrate Christmas when Jamie isn't here to hang his stocking, to wake us up at dawn, demanding to see what Santa brought." Duncan understood completely. He had been struggling with the same dilemma, torn between the desire to honor their son's memory and the need to move forward with their lives. Scout seemed to sense their distress, moving between them with unusual restlessness, as if trying to comfort both humans simultaneously. "Maybe we don't celebrate the way we used to," Duncan suggested carefully. "Maybe we find a new way, one that includes Jamie's memory, but also acknowledges that life continues." Molly was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Scout's head. As the puppy leaned against her leg, "I keep thinking about his Christmas stocking," she said finally. "It's still hanging by the fireplace where I left it last year. I couldn't bear to take it down, but I can't bear to look at it either." Duncan knew the stocking she meant, red wool with white trim, embroidered with Jamie's name in Molly's careful stitches. It had hung in their cabin every December since. Jamie was old enough to understand what Christmas meant, always the first thing their son looked for when he woke on Christmas morning. "What if we filled it?" Duncan suggested gently. "Not with presents for Jamie, but with things for Scout, things Jamie would have wanted his dog to have." The idea hung in the air between them, fragile but full of possibility. Scout looked up at Molly, as if sensing that something important was being decided, his tail wagging hopefully. "A collar with his name," Molly said slowly, warming to the idea. "And maybe some proper toys, the kind that would last through rough play. A warm blanket for cold nights," Duncan added. "And perhaps some special treats that Jamie would have enjoyed sharing." For the first time since their son's death, they began to plan for Christmas with something approaching anticipation. But their tentative happiness was shattered 3 days before the holiday, when Scout fell gravely ill. It started with a loss of appetite, which concerned but didn't alarm them. Puppies sometimes went through phases of finicky eating. But when Scout became listless, refusing even his favorite treats, Duncan and Molly knew something was seriously wrong. By evening, Scout was running a fever, his small body shaking with chills despite being wrapped in blankets by the fire. His breathing was labored, and his eyes, usually so bright and alert, were dull with illness. "Oh God," Molly whispered, holding Scout's trembling form against her chest. "Not again! Please, not again!" The parallels to Jamie's illness were unmistakable and terrifying. The fever, the sudden onset, the rapid progression from mild symptoms to serious concern. Dr. Carson examined Scout with professional thoroughness, her face grave, as she noted his elevated temperature and labored breathing. "It's pneumonia," she diagnosed grimly. "Common in young animals during harsh weather. I can treat it, but it will be touch and go for the next few days." Duncan felt the world tilting beneath his feet. They had been given this precious gift, this living embodiment of their son's love, only to face the possibility of losing him just as they had lost everything else that mattered. Molly's reaction was even more intense. She refused to leave Scout's side, holding him through the night. As his fever raged, whispering prayers and promises and desperate bargains with a God who had already taken too much from their family. "Please," she begged, her tears falling onto Scout's golden fur. "He's all we have left of Jamie. Please don't take him too." Duncan tried to comfort her, but his own fear was too overwhelming. What if they lost Scout? What if this innocent puppy, who had brought them back together and given them hope for healing, was taken from them just when they had learned to love again? The town rallied around them with the solidarity that marked frontier communities in times of crisis. Florence Whitfield brought soup and sat with Scout while Molly rested. Pastor Hughes led prayer circles for the puppy's recovery. Even the Whitmore children stopped by daily, their young faces solemn with concern for the dog who had brought joy to so many lives. But it was Mrs. Peterson who provided the most practical help, sharing remedies from her years of breeding dogs. Steam treatments, she advised, showing them how to create a humid environment to ease Scout's breathing and keep him warm, but not too warm. His body needs to fight the infection, but he can't do that if he's using all his energy to stay comfortable. For 3 days and nights, Duncan and Molly maintained their vigil, taking turns holding Scout, administering Dr. Carson's medicines, and praying with an intensity born of desperation. The puppy drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes seeming to recognize them, other times lost in fever dreams that made him whimper and shake. On the 3rd night, Christmas Eve, Scout's fever broke. Molly felt it happen, the sudden change. From burning heat to normal warmth as she held him against her chest. Scout's breathing eased, becoming deeper and more regular, and when he opened his eyes, they were clear and alert for the first time in days. "Duncan?" Molly whispered. Hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "I think he's better." Scout lifted his head weakly and licked Molly's hand, a gesture so reminiscent of his usual affectionate nature that both humans began to cry with relief. The crisis had passed. Their Christmas miracle had arrived not with fanfare, but with the simple return of a puppy's gentle spirit. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, Scout was well enough to show interest in food and water. He was still weak, still requiring careful attention, but the immediate danger had passed. Duncan and Molly sat together by the fire, Scout sleeping peacefully between them, and marveled at the gift of this moment. "I almost lost faith," Molly admitted quietly. "When I saw him so sick, so close to, I almost believed that God was cruel, that we were being punished for daring to love again." Duncan took her hand, understanding completely. "But we didn't lose him. He's here, he's healing, and we're all together." Molly looked at Jamie's Christmas stocking, still hanging by the fireplace, waiting to be filled with gifts for the puppy who had survived to receive them. "Jamie's still taking care of us," she said with wonder. "Even now, even from heaven, he's still making sure we have what we need to heal." Outside, Christmas morning was dawning clear and cold over Cedar Ridge, but inside the cabin, 3 hearts that had nearly been broken by loss were learning to beat with hope again. Christmas morning in the Mackenzie cabin dawned with a quiet miracle. Scout was not only alive, but showing unmistakable signs of recovery. His fever completely gone, his eyes bright with returning health. Duncan and Molly had dozed fitfully in their chairs through the night, neither willing to leave the puppy's side, and they woke to find him sitting up and regarding them with the patient intelligence that had characterized him from the beginning. "Good morning, sweet boy," Molly whispered, reaching out to stroke Scout's head. His tail began to wag, weakly but with genuine enthusiasm, and he leaned into her touch with the trust of a creature who knew he was completely loved. Duncan built up the fire while Molly prepared a light meal for Scout, following Dr. Carson's instructions about reintroducing food gradually after illness. The puppy ate with careful deliberation, his appetite clearly returning, but tempered by the wisdom that serious illness sometimes imparts, even to the very young. As Scout ate, Duncan retrieved Jamie's Christmas stocking from its place by the fireplace. The red wool felt soft and familiar in his hands, weighted with memories of Christmas mornings when their son would have already been awake for hours, barely containing his excitement about the treasures Santa had left. "Are you ready?" he asked Molly gently, holding up the stocking. Molly nodded, her eyes bright with tears that were no longer entirely sorrowful. Together they filled Jamie's stocking with the gifts they had planned for Scout, a soft leather collar with his name carefully burned into the surface, a collection of toys carved from wood and stuffed with soft fabric, and a small blanket woven from the finest wool they could afford. but it was the last gift that held the deepest meaning. Duncan reached into his pocket and withdrew the wooden dog toy that Jamie had carved in secret, the small figure that had been hidden under their son's mattress. He had spent the previous week carefully finishing the carving, smoothing the rough edges and adding details that Jamie's young hands hadn't been skilled enough to complete. "For Scout," Duncan said quietly, "from Jamie." Molly held the finished toy with reverence, marveling at how perfectly it resembled Scout, despite being carved months before they had ever seen the puppy. The resemblance was uncanny. From the alert ears to the gently waving tail, every detail seemed to have been crafted with Scout specifically in mind. When they presented the gifts to Scout, the puppy's reaction was everything they could have hoped for. He approached each item with careful curiosity, sniffing thoroughly before accepting each treasure. But when Duncan placed the wooden dog toy in front of him, Scout's response was remarkable. The puppy picked up the carving gently in his mouth, carrying it to his bed and setting it down with the care of a creature handling something precious. Then he lay down beside it, resting his head near the toy, as if acknowledging its significance in a way that transcended simple canine understanding. "He knows," Molly said softly, watching Scout's interaction with Jamie's creation. "Somehow, he knows that toy is special." Duncan knelt beside Scout and gently fitted the new collar around his neck, adjusting the leather carefully so it wouldn't chafe the puppy's still tender skin. The brass nameplate gleamed in the firelight, declaring to the world that this was Scout, not just any dog, but a beloved member of the Mackenzie family. "There," Duncan said with satisfaction, "now you're officially ours." Scout looked up at him with an expression that seemed almost human in its gratitude and understanding. The puppy's recovery had been more than just a return to physical health. It had been a transformation that somehow completed the healing process for all three of them. Molly moved to sit on the floor beside Scout, gathering him carefully into her lap. The puppy settled against her with complete contentment, no longer the frightened, fevered creature of the past few days, but once again the gentle, intuitive companion who had first captured their hearts. "I need to tell you something," Molly said to Duncan, her voice soft but clear. "While Scout was sick, while I was sitting here afraid we might lose him, I realized something important." Duncan settled beside them on the floor, creating a small circle of warmth and intimacy around the fire. "What did you realize?" "I realized that the fear of losing something precious doesn't make the love less worthwhile," Molly said, her fingers moving gently through Scout's coat. "For so long, I thought the only way to protect myself from more grief was to refuse to love anything again. But watching Scout struggle for his life, feeling that terrible possibility of loss, I understood that the love itself was worth the risk." She looked directly at Duncan, her eyes clear and certain for the first time in months. "I don't want to live in fear anymore, Duncan. I want to live in love, even knowing that love sometimes brings pain. Jamie wouldn't want us to hide from life because we were afraid of being hurt again." Duncan felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, not the breaking sensation he had grown accustomed to, but something like pieces fitting back together after being apart too long. "Does that mean—" "It means I want you to come home," Molly said simply. "I want us to be a family again, you, me, and Scout. I want us to build something new from what we have left, something that honors Jamie's memory while still allowing us to hope for happiness." Scout, as if understanding the importance of this moment, lifted his head and placed one small paw on each of their hands, connecting them in a gesture that seemed both innocent and profound. In the growing light of Christmas morning, three hearts that had been broken by loss began to beat together again, creating a rhythm of hope that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The walk from the old homestead to their cabin felt like a pilgrimage, each step marking their transition from separation back to unity. Duncan carried their few belongings, while Molly held Scout, who was still weak enough to need assistance, but alert enough to watch the familiar landscape pass by with bright, curious eyes. Cedar Ridge looked different somehow in the clear Christmas light. not changed physically, but transformed by their new perspective. The same buildings, the same snow-covered streets, but now imbued with the possibility of fresh beginnings rather than weighted with memories of loss. Mrs. Peterson waved from her porch, her weathered face creasing into a smile of satisfaction when she saw the three of them walking together. Florence Whitfield emerged from the church, where she had been arranging flowers for the Christmas service, her expression one of profound relief and joy. "The whole town's been praying for that puppy," she called out as they passed. "And for you, too, as well. It's good to see you walking together again." The cabin itself seemed to welcome them home. Molly had prepared for this moment, cleaning and arranging things to accommodate Scout's presence without erasing the signs of their normal life. A soft rug beside the fireplace marked Scout's sleeping area, and food and water bowls sat ready near the kitchen. But it was the mantelpiece that showed the most significant change. Jamie's photograph still held its place of honor, but now it was flanked by two new items: the wooden dog toy their son had carved, and a small sketch that the town's artist had made of Scout during his recovery. A portrait that captured not just the puppy's physical appearance, but something of his gentle spirit. "It's perfect," Duncan said, setting down their bags and looking around the space that would now be home to all three of them. "Jamie would love knowing that Scout is here, with us." Scout, despite his recent illness, seemed to understand the significance of this moment. He walked carefully around the cabin, sniffing corners and investigating furniture with the thoroughness of a creature claiming his territory. When he reached Jamie's old bedroom, he paused at the threshold, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. "What is it, boy?" Molly asked, following Scout to the doorway. Scout entered the room slowly, his steps measured and deliberate. The space had been left largely unchanged since Jamie's death. The bed still made with the same quilt, the shelves still holding the books and treasures that had belonged to their son. Scout approached the bed and sat down beside it, not jumping up, but simply positioning himself as if standing guard. "He's protecting Jamie's room," Duncan realized, watching the puppy's serious posture. "He knows this space was important to someone he never met, and he's showing respect." Molly knelt beside Scout, stroking his head as tears slipped down her cheeks. But these were different tears than the bitter ones she had shed for so many months. These were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of a grief that had been transformed from destroying force into something that could coexist with love. "Thank you," she whispered to Scout, though both humans understood she was speaking to someone else as well. "Thank you for bringing us back together." The afternoon passed quietly as they settled into their new routine. Scout napped frequently, still recovering from his illness, but when he was awake, he moved through the cabin with the confidence of a dog who knew he belonged. Duncan and Molly found themselves talking easily for the first time in months. Not just about practical matters, but about hopes, fears, and the future they might build together. "I've been thinking about spring," Molly said, as they prepared their first dinner together as a reunited family. "About the wildflowers we talked about, planting around Jamie's grave. Maybe we could make it a tradition, Scout and us, tending Jamie's garden every year." Duncan nodded, imagining their son's resting place transformed into a place of beauty rather than simply sorrow. He'd like that. And Scout could learn to be gentle around the flowers, to understand that some places are special, as if responding to his name. Scout lifted his head from where he was dozing by the fire. The wooden dog toy that Jamie had carved lay beside him, positioned carefully within easy reach. The sight of puppy and carving together created a visual bridge between past and present that filled both adults with wonder. That evening, as they sat together by the fire with Scout sleeping peacefully between them, Duncan and Molly began to plan not just for the immediate future, but for the years to come. They talked about the life they would build with Scout, the ways they would honor Jamie's memory while still allowing themselves to experience joy. "Do you think he knows?" Molly asked softly, her hand resting on Scout's sleeping form. "Do you Think Jamie knows that his gift reached us, that it worked the way he hoped it would." Duncan looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece, at their son's bright smile and trusting eyes, and felt certainty settle over him like a warm blanket. "I think he knows," he said simply. "I think he's been watching over us all along, making sure we found our way back to each other." Outside, Christmas evening was settling over Cedar Ridge, bringing with it the promise of new traditions, new hopes, and new ways of being a family. Inside the cabin, 3 hearts that had been scattered by grief had found their way back to each other, guided by the enduring love of a child who understood that the greatest gift he could give his parents was the chance to love again. 1 year later, on a warm spring morning in 1885, Duncan and Molly Mackenzie walked hand in hand through the wildflower meadow they had planted around Jamie's grave. Scout trotted beside them, no longer the fragile puppy they had nearly lost, but a strong, confident dog whose golden coat gleamed in the Montana sunshine. Around his neck he wore a new collar, still leather, still bearing his name, but now also engraved with a simple inscription, "Jamie's Gift." The meadow had exceeded all their expectations. Mountain daisies, lupines, and Indian paintbrush created a tapestry of color that shifted with the seasons, providing a living memorial that celebrated life rather than mourning death. Scout moved carefully among the flowers, his training evident in the way he avoided disturbing the delicate blooms while still enjoying their sweet scents. "He would have loved this," Molly said softly, watching Scout investigate a cluster of daisies with gentle curiosity. "Jamie always said flowers were like nature's way of smiling." Duncan squeezed her hand, marveling at how naturally hope had returned to his wife's voice. The past year had not been without its challenges. Grief doesn't disappear overnight, and there had been difficult days when memories threatened to overwhelm their fragile peace. But Scout's presence had provided a constant anchor, his unwavering devotion and intuitive understanding helping them navigate the complicated waters of healing. The dog had proven to be everything Jamie could have hoped for and more. His intelligence was remarkable, his loyalty absolute, and his ability to sense human emotion bordered on the supernatural. But it was his capacity for bringing people together that had truly transformed their lives and the lives of everyone around them. What had started as personal healing had gradually expanded into something larger. Other families in Cedar Ridge, drawn by Scout's gentle nature and the story of his arrival, had begun to seek out the Mackenzies when they faced their own losses and struggles. Scout seemed to understand his role instinctively, offering comfort to grieving children, companionship to lonely elderly residents, and hope to anyone who had forgotten how to find it for themselves. Dr. Carson had been the first to recognize Scout's unusual gifts. "He's what we might call a natural therapy dog," she had explained during one of Scout's regular checkups. "Some animals are born with an instinctive understanding of human need. They seem to know exactly when to approach and when to give space, when to be playful and when to simply offer quiet presence." This recognition had led to a remarkable development: the establishment of Cedar Ridge's first formal program for using animals to help people heal from trauma and loss. Duncan and Molly had become the unofficial coordinators of this effort, with Scout serving as both the inspiration and the primary participant. The program had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. Families dealing with illness, elderly residents struggling with isolation, and children facing various difficulties had all found solace in Scout's gentle presence. The dog had even helped several other families introduce pets into their homes, serving as a bridge between fear and trust. "Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday that her grandson hasn't had a single nightmare since Scout started visiting," Molly mentioned as they continued their walk through the flower meadow. 3 months of peaceful sleep after 2 years of terror. That's Jamie's gift working through Scout. Duncan nodded, thinking of all the lives that had been touched by their son's wisdom. The memorial fund they had established in Jamie's name had helped dozens of families afford pets for therapeutic purposes, creating a legacy of healing that extended far beyond their own experience. Scout had also fulfilled another of Jamie's dreams in an unexpected way. The previous autumn, he had fathered a litter of puppies with a female golden retriever from a neighboring farm. The 5 puppies had inherited not only their father's beautiful coat, but also his remarkable temperament, his intuitive understanding of human emotion, and his gentle spirit. 4 of the puppies had been placed with carefully selected families who needed exactly what Scout had provided for Duncan and Molly. The 5th, a small female with Scout's exact coloring, had remained with the Mackenzies. They had named her Hope, and she was already showing signs of inheriting her father's extraordinary gifts. "Look at that," Molly said, pointing to where Scout was gently nosing Hope away from a delicate cluster of flowers. "He's teaching her to respect the garden, just like we hoped he would." The sight of father and daughter working together among Jamie's flowers created a moment of perfect symmetry. Past, present, and future united in a single, beautiful image. Duncan felt his throat tighten with emotion as he recognized how completely their son's vision had been realized. As they prepared to leave the meadow, Duncan noticed something that made him pause. Scout had positioned himself precisely at the center of the flower garden, sitting with perfect posture as if posing for an invisible photographer. Hope sat beside him, mimicking her father's stance with the serious attention of a young student. "They're saying goodbye to Jamie," Molly realized, her voice filled with wonder. "They do this every time we visit. Sit there for a few minutes before we leave, as if they're reporting to him about how we're all doing." Duncan felt the familiar sting of tears, but they were good tears now, tears of gratitude rather than despair. "I think they're telling him that his plan worked," he said softly, "that we're happy again, that we're taking care of each other, that love really is the strongest force in the world." As they walked back toward town, Scout and Hope trotting contentedly beside them, Duncan and Molly reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The mountain man who had once fled to the wilderness to escape his grief had learned that healing comes not from isolation but from connection. The woman who had once believed that loving again would betray her son's memory had discovered that the deepest way to honor the dead is to live fully in their name. Behind them, the wildflower meadow swayed gently in the mountain breeze, a living testament to the enduring power of love and the wisdom of a child who had understood that even death could not break the bonds that tie hearts together. Scout wore Jamie's name on his collar, Hope carried the promise of continued healing in her gentle spirit, and Duncan and Molly carried their son's love in hearts that had learned to hope again. The mountain man and his puppy had found their way, home not to the place they had started, but to something even more precious, a future built on love, sustained by memory, and blessed by the enduring presence of a child whose greatest gift was teaching his parents that healing is always possible. When guided by faith in the power of unconditional love,